Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all of them kind of things. So you couldn't rest. And you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day, took him home, and said he cal'lated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months but set in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him, too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somerset, or maybe a couple, if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right, like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies, and kept him in practice so constant, that he'd nail a fly every time, as fur as he could see 'em. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I'd seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor, Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And quicker'n you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off in the counter there, and flop down on the floor again, as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he hadn't no idea he'd been doing any more than a frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground in one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand. And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywheres all said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, come across him with his box and says, "What might be that you got in that box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful, and turned it round this way and that, and says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing. I should judge he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again, and took another long, particular look, and gave it back to Smiley, and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and then says, kinder sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, "That's all right. That's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while, thinking and thinking to himself. And then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot. Filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog and fetched him in, and gave him to this feller, and says, "Now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel, with his forepaws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, "1, 2, 3, get!" And him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively, but Daniel give a heave and h'isted up his shoulders, so, like a Frenchman. But it warn't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out at the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder at Daniel and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last says, I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off, for I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel up by the nape of his neck and hefted him and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds." And turned him upside down, and he belched out a handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set that frog down and took out after that feller, but he never catched him. And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and got up to see just what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But, by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond, Jim Smiley, would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced, "Well, this year Smiley had a yaller one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and—" However, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave.